Evening, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. I hope that by now most of you have been vaccinated and that all of us are still stay safe and wearing masks and reading 800-page biographies. My name is Kai Bird, and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event will be on May 25th with Susan Pernofsky and Thad Zilkowski, our own Thad. They will be discussing Bernofsky's biography of the eccentric Swiss-German writer Robert Walser. Please mark your calendars and register for this free event on the Leon Levy website. And please tell your friends also to add their emails to our website so that we can notify them of future events. But tonight we are here to celebrate not one, but two Pulitzer Prize biographers, John Matteson and Debby Applegate. They will be in conversation about Madison's new book, A Worse Place Than Hell. This riveting history tells the story of the 1862 Battle of Fredericksburg via a series of slices of life, focusing on Oliver Wendell Holmes, Walt Whitman, Louisa May Alcott, and others. John Madison is a distinguished professor of English at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the recipient of the 2008 Pulitzer Prize in Biography for his first book, Eden's Outcasts, the story of Louisa May Alcott and her father. A former deputy director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, he is also a former fellow at the center whose support assisted him in writing his second book, The Lives of Margaret Fuller, a winner of the Anne Sperber Prize. Debby Applegate won the Pulitzer Prize for Biography for her first book, The Most Famous Man in America, the biography of Henry Ward Beecher. And she is the author of Madam, the forthcoming book, Madam, the biography of Polly Adler, icon of the jazz age, forthcoming from, excuse me, from Doubleday in September 2021. She holds a PhD in American Studies from Yale University and lives in New Haven, Connecticut. I'm sure we'll be hearing more from her about her new book this coming November. Please look for these biographies online at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your own local independent bookstore. Debby will be conducting a conversation with John. Sorry, I have a slight cold. Debby will be conducting a conversation with John for about 40 minutes, and then they will take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the question below to type in your questions in the chat box, and Debby will be sure to get to as many as she can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. John Madison, congratulations once again on this formidable accomplishment. I understand that John will begin with a short slide presentation, and then Debby will start the conversation. John, take it away.
Well, thank you very much, Kai. And before I get started in earnest, I would just like to take a moment to say how delighted I am to be making this appearance with the Leon Levy Center for Biography, because as you mentioned off the top, I have had a very close and profitable personal association with the center over the years as a fellow, and as you kindly mentioned, as the deputy director some years back. And it's been wonderful for me to see what you have done with the center. It's really prospered under your vigilant eye. And of course, my thanks to Shelby White as well, who really cannot be thanked enough for everything that she does for the center, also for biography in general. So it's great to be back, and I also look forward to your own book, The Outlier, the Jimmy Carter biography that's coming out middle of next month. So so good for that. And Debbie too. I don't want to get started without saying a word or two about the book that Kai already mentioned, Madam, the biography of Polly Adler, icon of the Jazz Age. You know, I've been lucky enough, thanks to you, to read about the first 30, 35 pages of it, and it's dynamite. It's just really fantastic. And so anyway, good luck with the launch, and I just know it's going to bring you a lot of great things. So I can imagine someone looking at the title of my book and saying, well, that's not biography. What's he doing speaking at the Levy Center? Well, part of the answer is that, as Kai mentioned, A Worse Place Than Hell really is a group biography. It's about 5 Americans whom I'll introduce in a moment. All of whose lives were transformed by the Battle of Fredericksburg, and who, because of the way that Fredericksburg changed them, ended up in one way or another having a subsequent impact on the development of American culture. So one of the things that I was consciously trying to do in A Worse Place Than Hell was to test the strength of the membrane that has traditionally separated history from biography. Because somewhere along the line, I seem to have contracted a sort of biographical bug. So that even when I try to write straight history, I find myself being drawn back into biography. And for me, the two fields really are variants of each other. And I really have trouble conceptualizing history apart from the individual and the personal. And one of the features, in fact, that I love about biography is that it continually rejiggers my understanding of history. There's a way of thinking about history that obviously concerns itself with mass movements, large forces, and we need that. But something interesting happens when you tighten the focus and when you start thinking along the lines of individualized experience. And biography is wonderful for helping us to see beyond the categories that historians often impose for the sake of simplicity and order, and to improve our perspective in a variety of ways. In the book, I shift away from the tautological tendency to think of a battle solely as a military event. Obviously, a battle is by definition a military action, but I wanted to see what would happen if I were to take a battle like Fredericksburg and to look at it in terms of its cultural impact, and to ask, how did the future of the country change in terms of its law, in terms of its literature, in terms of its popular mythology? How is that different as compared to if the battle had never happened? So that's one thing I had in mind. Another was to shift, as I've hinted, from the general to the specific and to the personal. I still talk about what regiment did what, but I'm more interested in how the battle looked and felt to certain representative individuals. An army chaplain crossing under fire into the town of Fredericksburg at the beginning of the battle, a Confederate artillery major blazing away with a single cannon and holding off the advance of a third of Ambrose Burnside's army, a young Pennsylvania blacksmith participating in his first charge and sustaining a mortal wound. The thing about military history that's kind of surprising is that it can actually get kind of dull if you're just saying, and then the 27th Indiana advanced 50 yards. A biographical approach kind of breaks down the conventions of military history. And if you do it in a certain way, I think it helps to restore kind of the life and the vitality of the event. Okay, so we're now, I guess, looking at a slide of, and it's titled "The Charge of Humphrey's Division, 13 December 1862." One of the things that I tried to capture in the book was the desperation and the futility of the Union experience at Fredericksburg. Lee's men occupied a position behind a stone wall above a slow, steady incline. The wall was just the right height for placing a musket on. And one of the Confederate officers surveying the field before the battle said that he didn't think that a chicken could live on the field once the Confederates opened fire over it. Burnside's men on the 13th of December attempt 15 separate assaults on this position, and none of them get to within 50 yards of the wall. And so here, actually in this slide, you're looking at the last attack of the day, led by General A.A. Humphreys. You can see him in the middle distance on the horse, waving his hat. If we had audio for this illustration, you would actually hear him singing a hit song of the time called "Gay and Happy," which I've never really been able to understand. Why would you sing that in the midst of all this chaos? But it is in this charge that the Union makes its last attempt of the day to save the day and to win the battle. And the soldiers marching forward are being grasped by their pant legs and their boots by previously wounded soldiers, begging them not to go forward because they think that these soldiers are on their way to certain death. Now, one of the many soldiers who takes part in this hopeless attack is a Pennsylvania blacksmith named John Surrey, who figures prominently in the middle chapters of my book. And I don't have a picture of him. We may talk about him later, but apparently no pictures of him exist. But I do have a picture of the nurse who cared for him, and that's going to come up on the screen, I hope, in just a second. So if we could have slide, thank you. So this, of course, is Louisa May Alcott, the future author, as we all know, of Little Women. She's grown up as a tomboy, the rebellious daughter of a placid, quixotic, ne'er-do-well transcendental philosopher, Bronson Alcott. She wished that she could be a man so that she could take part in the fighting. And when Fredericksburg takes place, she has just joined the Union Army in the only capacity open to her, and that is as a member of the nursing corps. And Fredericksburg produces the first large wave of casualties that she attends to. She writes a book about these experiences. It's called Hospital Sketches, which both puts her on the map as a writer and also, in her own estimation, teaches her her style. So Alcott had an official commission as an Army nurse. The picture of the man you're about to see did not. He was a nurse also, but only in a very unofficial capacity, and that's Walt Whitman, the famous author of Leaves of Grass. Whitman has been demoralized by the Civil War. He has seen his beloved republic torn in two. He spends the first couple of years of the war in just abject despondency. He spends night after night in a literally underground dive bar in Manhattan in a period that he refers to later as his quicksand years. And a few days after Fredericksburg, Whitman learns that his brother George is among the wounded in the battle. Walt races to the battlefield and quickly finds a new purpose for his life. Instead of going back to New York, he goes to Washington, D.C. He gets a hand-to-mouth job working for the government, and he spends every spare minute in the hospitals, caring for the sick and wounded. And those years transform Whitman, both as a man and as a poet. And I think if you're listening, you may already be hearing kind of an emerging theme in these stories. And that theme might be characterized as self-knowledge through struggle. To go with my two nurses, I also write about a pair of combat soldiers. And the first one will come up in a second. The handsome, dashing, and at that moment mustachioed Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. Wendell is an officer in the 20th Massachusetts Infantry. Like Alcott, he's the son of a famous man, the poet, novelist, and anatomy instructor at Harvard Medical School, Oliver Wendell Holmes Sr. Now, Wendell Jr. Continually clashes with Wendell Sr. He seeks to win his father's love, but also to outshine and outdo him. But for Wendell Holmes, Fredericksburg is an anticlimax. He has to stay behind. As his regiment gets shot to pieces, he is in a hospital tent suffering from a horrible case of dysentery. And his absence, while his regiment is really getting shot up horribly, engenders in him both a lasting sense of guilt and also a deep brooding over the concept of the limits of duty. And that concern about duty is something that crops up very prominently as he formulates his legal philosophy after the war. And as we know, Holmes ends his career as a very influential Associate Justice of the US Supreme Court. My other soldier is John Pelham, the only Confederate, nicely colorized in this picture, the only professional soldier of my group. He's been described as the perfect Confederate idol. He's young, as you see, he's handsome, endlessly courageous, and preternaturally gifted as an artillery tactician. He is a wonderful, wonderful young man in everything but his pro-slavery politics. At Fredericksburg, he becomes famous, as I mentioned in passing earlier, holding off an entire third of the Union Army at a critical hour with just a single cannon. The last of my five is the most obscure, but he's also probably the most poignant, and that's Arthur B. Fuller. He's the son of a four-term congressman, Timothy Fuller, and he's also the brother of Margaret Fuller, a leading intellectual, one of America's first transformative feminists. Arthur is kind of pushed in the background in his family. He's sickly. He has lost an eye in a childhood accident. All of the pictures that one sees of him tend to be either three-quarter or profile because he doesn't want his injury to be seen. He has, in his own view, never lived up to his family's reputation or to his own personally held ideals of manhood. He's a Unitarian minister, and he joins the Army as the chaplain of the 16th Massachusetts Infantry. For him, service is an attempt at fulfillment. It's a shot at redemption, and it ends in unexpected fashion in the streets of Fredericksburg, Virginia. So that's my cast of characters, and having sort of situated us within the narrative, I'm going to turn now to my dear friend, Debby Applegate, and we can have a conversation, answer a few questions. Debby, I think you're on mute.
You can still, I'm still new to this. While everyone else was Zooming all year, I was in the library like a good girl. I was going to jump right into questions of craft rather than interpretation of the Civil War, but I might start with what is both a big question and a simple question. What made you go back to the Civil War? These are well-trodden paths. It's easy to feel like your stories could get lost in a welter of stories around it. So how'd you decide on a Civil War book to begin with?
Yeah, there are a couple ways of answering that question, Debby. I mean, one of them is just kind of the practical thing that happened, which was that when I was finishing up my previous volume, The Annotated Little Women, I paid a visit to the offices of Norton, and I was actually called into the office of another editor, not my editor, but a wonderful, wonderful, smart guy named Bob Weil. And Bob asked me, well, what's your next project? And I didn't really know at that point. So I spun out a few ideas for him. And he said, well, you know, those sound like good small books, but John, it's time for you to write a big book. And I thought, well, I think I've already written.
Yeah, I was about to say, not good enough.
But just sort of spitballing on the spot, you know, I said, you know, I've always kind of wanted to write a Civil War book, and I've got these stories of people I'm already interested in because I've written about Louisa May Alcott, and I've written a book on Arthur Fuller's sister Margaret, and these other figures are also people whom I really find fascinating. And so I started doing just some of the background research and realized a few things. One was that all of these, and I'll go ahead and call them characters, balance so beautifully and help to illuminate themes that I really wanted to explore, like the nature of courage. You've got someone like Pelham, the professional soldier, who is just a natural on the battlefield, as opposed to somebody like Arthur Fuller, who barely knows which end of the gun the bullet comes out of. And yet they're both trying to manifest courage in the ways that they're capable of doing. There's also a lot of balance with respect to the family stories, right? Everybody talks about the Civil War as, this contest between, brother against brother. But I was interested too in this idea of the Civil War as fathers against children, okay? Because there's tension between Louisa May Alcott and her father. There's tension between Wendell Holmes and his father, and Arthur Fuller trying to dig out from under the reputation of this four-term congressman who went to church with John Quincy Adams. How do you live up to that as a son? And so the other thing about it was, just serendipitously, all of the stories that I'm telling put me at places in the Fredericksburg battlefield that are just absolutely perfect. You've got Fuller at the first part of the battle, a little bit later you get Pelham. Each one of these stories just sort of naturally seems to flow in succession, so that I can be every place that I want to be in narrating the battle, which is a secondary concern, but an important one. And to take this compendium of biographies and bring it together into a story. I have a situation earlier in the book, before the Battle of Fredericksburg, where Oliver Wendell Holmes is going into battle at Antietam, and who's firing cannons trying to kill him? John Pelham, the guy on the other side of the line. Mm-hmm. So those were all reasons why this this project was attractive to me. But another one is that it just brings together so many things that I've cared about at various times in my life. Because I was a Civil War nut when I was a kid. I learned about John Pelham when I was like 12 or 13 years old. I went to law school, so I care about Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and his impact on American law. And then this host of literary figures, Whitman, Alcott, and Margaret Fuller through Arthur. So it all just came together fabulously. So that's the long answer.
So you were looking at your material as much as, look what wonderful leftovers I have intellectually in my mind from prior thinking. Did you have the themes already there? I mean, would you have said you wanted to write a book about courage, which is such great.
Yeah, I did something, Debbie, with this book that I've never done before, kind of as an experiment. What I decided that I would do was, before, after doing some of the preliminary research, but before doing very much of the writing, I sat down and I wrote out pages of essay questions that I thought that an attentive reader would be interested in answering after having read my book. And so it was kind of reasoning backward from those questions and thinking, okay, these are, this is where the themes are coming from. So in that sense, it was unlike anything that I've ever really tried to do before. And of course, dealing with five figures instead of one or two, you just end up being more thematic and kind of more big think, perhaps, than a biography of a single figure can enable you to do. So that was part of it. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask, because I don't think of biography as my natural genre. I definitely enjoyed biographies as a younger person, as a big reader. But I feel like the reason I ended up choosing biography, and I'm not sure it was such a great choice, because good heavens, it's a lot of work for a lot of pages. And anyway, that's a first subject for a different day. But I feel like I chose it for instrumental reasons, that I like history. I love mucking around in the past, but readers can get into the flow of history. They can see it better through the eyes of single characters, or in this case, maybe multiple characters, because we are a narcissistic species and we tend to reason out from our own experience. So I don't feel like biography is a conceptual approach to history as much as a convenient way to reach people, but maybe you have something different. And of course, we all know the boogeyman of the great man theory of history. I don't know if anyone really subscribes to that nowadays anyway, but do you see it more as reader oriented or intellectually conceptually oriented, the youth?
Yeah, wow. Okay, so that's a mouthful. You mentioned in passing the the idea of the sort of the great man or great person theory of history, and it's not that that really attracts me. There are wonderful biographers, many of whom also have connections with the Levy Center, who are very, very interested in the workings of power. And how you get power, how you wield it, and so forth. And I'm thinking of David Nassau. I'm thinking of Robert Caro. These are people who have just analyzed power, uh, maybe better than it's possibly ever been done. And I could mention others as well. But what interests me more is people who don't have as much power, who are struggling with issues of gender, who are struggling with issues of some disadvantage in life that they need to deal with and overcome. So I think of myself more as a bard of the underdog, for one thing, than as someone who's really concerned with how history is changed by the great person. But history does get changed by individuals, often in ways that the individuals themselves didn't really anticipate. And Alcott's an example of that. Somebody who starts off her career just trying to make money and pay the bills for the family, and writing kind of fantasy blood and thunder bodice ripper stories, and then realizing that she's got this incredible gift for taking moments from her own life and making them real, and you cut them and they bleed. And that's what she discovers with hospital sketches. But I don't know if I've really completely answered your question. You also talked about the fact that biography is not kind of the natural genre for you. For me, it's always just seemed to fit, because I think in terms of my rhetoric, I think I'm a pretty good storyteller, but I can't come up with original characters or plot lines to save my soul. But I'm lucky in that if you drop me down in an archive and you show me some journals and you show me some letters, something happens, and I'm capable of infusing them with a kind of narrative connection that that some people seem to like. So that's my good fortune.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. That may be why I'm here. I want to take a moment to encourage people to ask some questions in our little chat box here, presuming I am seeing the chat box correctly, any kind. So it sounds like you did a lot of original research, even though, of course, there's a lot of secondary research on this.
Yeah, I was lucky in that some of my figures, have had their papers published, so that anything I wanted to find of Walt Whitman's, I could find very easily. Pretty much anything that I wanted of Holmes was at my fingertips, and I already knew the Alcott archive extremely well. I did have to do more digging with Pelham and Fuller. I ended up traveling to Alabama and looking and visiting some public libraries that had collections relating to Pelham, and discovering things that had been overlooked by previous biographers. And the one that chestnut that I discovered down there, I think you'll find this is kind of fun. But I found a manual for young men that evidently Pelham's father, Dr. Atkinson Pelham, had given to John when John was preparing to go off to West Point. And it talks all about honesty and how to hit the books properly when you're in college and not wasting your time with parties and so on. And then there's this passage that's about 3 or 4 pages long, in which the author says, what I am going to discuss now is of such an obscene nature that I can write it only in Latin. And the following 4 pages are all about how you shouldn't engage in the sin of self-abuse, shall we say. And you can imagine boys being given this book and really starting to study their Latin, so they what it's all about. And Pelham's father was a doctor, and so he actually wrote in the margins, "I have seen young men destroyed by this vice. Mark this Latin well." And you find something like that, and you just say, "Oh boy,"
Such a delight.
Yeah.
Well, that makes me wonder, how did you, I've never dealt with this many characters. I just can't imagine. First of all, you wrote this book in record time, as far as I am concerned. So you wrote with tremendous elegance, reasonable speed, and yet you had the material for 5 biographies. You must have had some guiding principles, maybe your essay questions, I guess, that you laid out. I mean, how did you? I can't even imagine. How did you handle all that material?
Well, it's funny that you tell me that I wrote fast, because as you know, no matter how fast you're going, it always feels slow as molasses. And I find this particularly when I'm researching and I find something that I really want to write about. I just, do I have to keep researching? I want to dive into this. I want to get it done. And so research has this way of sort of holding you back in a sense. So anyway, I kind of lost the thread of your.
Oh, how the hell did you cut it all down?
How did I organize it?
Yeah, I mean, how? Because that's always the biggest question I find especially new biographers have. It's just so much. How do I organize it beyond just chronology? And even harder when you've got 5.
Yeah. Well, there's an introductory chapter rather for each of the 5 figures. And the way that I do it is by not beginning with the Battle of Fredericksburg, but by starting about 3 months earlier with a previous battle, the Battle of Antietam. At that battle, Oliver Wendell Holmes gets wounded. John Pelham does some amazing tactical stuff, and George Whitman, Walt's brother, is a hero in a famous charge across a structure called Burnside's Bridge. And so already at that part of the story, I'm combining biographical background with a historical narrative, which is starting to pick up with Antietam and will gather momentum as it goes toward the Battle of Fredericksburg. Okay, and once again,
you've got your convenient introduction chapter that's posed on an event. So one thing is you're using events really like big tent poles. It sounds like hooks.
Yeah, that's fair to say. So I introduced the first 3 stories in the first 3 chapters. And then I take a step back and I provide some narrative to sort of get the action moving from Antietam to Fredericksburg. And that's the first quote unquote book of the book. It's divided into 5 sections with a prologue and epilogue, and each of those 5 sections has its own separate title and kind of its own separate function. And the Battle of Fredericksburg is smack in the middle in book 3.
Did you feel like you were using a sort of Aristotelian arc of storytelling there with exposition, climax, denouement there?
Yeah, very much. Someone whom I've admired a great deal as a biographer is Stacy Schiff, and Stacy is very fond of saying in her public utterances that biographer is a novelist under oath. And so using that description and taking it rather seriously, I do tend to structure books in a kind of novelistic way with rising and falling action and sort of denouement and catharsis at the end. So that's all definitely happening. Yeah.
I interrupted you though, because you were saying you got to the battle in the middle, and then you sort of do the play out, the falling action and denouement then in the last third, is that, or last two sections?
The last two out of the five. Yeah, there's one called Two Nurses, which is the subsequent story of Alcott and Whitman after the battle. And then the final chunk is called Two Soldiers, which follows Pelham and Holmes thereafter. And one of the challenges of the structure was that Oliver Wendell Holmes lives more than 30 years longer than anybody else in the book. Whitman dies in 1892, and that leaves Holmes among my five as the last man standing until 1934. And so, that was kind of awkward. And so I had to kind of tailor it. And I don't talk very much about Holmes's career on the Supreme Court, but a considerable bit more about the way he forms his legal philosophy in the years before he ascends to the bench, leading up in particular to a book of his called The Common Law, which is a very important treatise in American legal studies, even to this day, and from which we get the line that the history of the law is not logic but experience. And so, and it is the experience of the Civil War that informs Holmes's understandings of how power works and how justice works and so forth. So, and I mentioned earlier in my introductory comments this idea of duty, because he really feels that he hasn't done his duty as a soldier, even though he gets wounded 3 times and watches almost all of his friends either getting killed or sustaining crippling injuries. He still never really feels that it's enough. And so he's very concerned with this notion of, well, how far does the concept of duty in the law extend? How much do any of us owe to society in terms of the way that we organize our lives and conduct our behavior?
We have other questions here, although all I really want to do is take that question of duty and ask. I won't do it, but I would love to hear you someday extrapolate about how we are now in a place where duty seems to have completely fallen out of fashion as a concept, as a civic concept. I know there are people, of course, who don't believe that, but it's not in the discourse. But instead of doing that, because that's another hour, I want to actually pivot for a second to a great question that I think follows up on the Oliver Wendell Holmes living so long, which is Gail Feldman has a question. Was there any point at which one or two of the characters threatened to take over, which I can imagine must have been a constant threat?
It's an excellent question, and I'm lucky enough to say that I think the answer is no. I think I had a fairly good sense of how I was going to balance these figures out, all the way through. There are figures in this book who are stronger than others, and a couple of them, die along the way as well. Chaplain Fuller was killed at the Battle of Fredericksburg. John Pelham lives for only 3 months afterwards. And so, yeah, I mean, from that point of view, you raise a good point. And if there is a hero in this story, a main character, it is Holmes, because I begin with Holmes. Because of the chronology, end with Holmes. And Holmes also is a man of just remarkable intellectual power. He's, with apologies to Margaret Fuller, who runs a very respectable second, he is the most brilliant person I've written about at length. And so I found in him kind of a challenge, to be able to kind of keep up with him in the depth of his understanding. So at the end of the book, he does take over because he's the only one left. And the last 2 chapters of book 5 are solely devoted to him. And then I also come back to him at the end of the epilogue. But in terms of one taking over, I hope not so much. Debby mentioned that it must have been difficult to keep all of these balls in the air at the same time, and to narrate essentially 5 stories at once. One of the things that was great about that, though, was I got to do cliffhangers, right? I could end a chapter with Holmes getting shot through the neck and, oh, what's going to happen next? And another chapter where, Louisa's on her deathbed at the hospital and her father's coming to save her. Will he get there in time? It's kind of hard to do real cliffhangers with nonfiction because anybody can go up on Wikipedia or and know where it's heading. But it's kind of fun, to the extent that a nonfiction writer can, to play a little bit of the suspense game. And so I had a lot of enjoyment, in fact, doing that. I wanted to mention too, with respect to the idea of the novelist under oath, another book that I kind of kept at my elbow when I was at least drafting A Worse Place Than Hell is Christopher Booker's book called The Seven Basic Plots, which talks about the seven classic storylines of in Western literature, and it's things like tragedy, comedy, slaying the monster, rags to riches, and fortunately enough, a lot of the true to life stories in A Worse Place Than Hell lend themselves to that kind of writing. Louisa May Alcott has a rags to riches. Every one of them is kind of engaged in slaying the monster. There is tragedy. There's rebirth. There's there are all of these sort of very kind of classically, reliably rewarding story arcs that I could observe in the nonfiction work, and without verging into fiction at all, importing that kind of narrative energy into the book that I wrote.
Let me then go to a question from Kai Bird, which his question was, were there any surprises in the archives about Walt Whitman or Holmes? But I might even rephrase it even a little bit more. You've got your beautiful arcs, your archetypal plots that they seem to fit so well. Did you find stuff that was not just surprising in the archives, but that kind of got in the way of the plot that seemed to be working so well for each of your characters?
Oh gosh, now Kai's going to make me feel guilty because oh gosh, I should have found something hard, that threw me off, and maybe if I didn't, that makes me less of a writer. I don't know, but the thing that would I call it a surprise? I don't know, but the biggest revelation was discovering more about the identity of a particular soldier whom Alcott cares for at the Union Hotel Hospital in Georgetown, and whom she later writes about in her book Hospital Sketches. This is someone by the name of John Surrey. And Alcott, in her journals and also in Hospital Sketches, I think, describes him as a 30-year-old Virginia blacksmith. And for 150 years, nobody's been able to actually find the guy. And just by happenstance, as I was doing some of the background reading, I found a reference in a secondary source to someone who sounded a heck of a lot like John Surrey. And so I got onto that trail, and I was able to discover that the reason why no one was able to find this guy was that Louisa May Alcott herself got a lot of the details wrong. She describes him, as I mentioned, as a 30-year-old Virginia blacksmith. He was 21, and he was from Pennsylvania, okay? And he was in the 133rd Pennsylvania Volunteer Regiment. And once I knew what regiment he was in, I could figure out where he was on the battlefield, that he took part in this last futile charge of the day, that the battle had already been lost, that this was a life that was in one sense horribly and cavalierly wasted, but a life that we would really know nothing about if he had not been wounded and come into the care of Louisa May Alcott, and in fact changed her career, because Hospital Sketches centers really on the story of John Surrey. It's the part that people cried over. It's the part that they wanted to read. And she says in her journals that John Surrey was responsible for the success of Hospital Sketches. And without Hospital Sketches, we don't have Little Women. Right. So it was exciting for me. It didn't throw me off, but it threw me into a deeper depth of understanding to be able to know who John Surrey was, and to save him, to sort of pull him out of the tomb of the unknown soldier, and to give him a second life, such that we know the names of his parents and where he was born, and so on. Curiously enough, he was a blacksmith, and his blacksmith's forge was in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. And if you remember the name Shanksville, it's where the 4th plane went down on 9/11. So
Oh,
odd coincidence.
well, that's a delight. That I love an archive story. I'm going to turn to first a compliment from a reader, Bernard Peachy. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I'm going to read it with great enthusiasm because that's how it's written. This book is terrific. You are a wonderful writer. I especially liked your deep understanding of Lincoln's thought process leading to the Emancipation Proclamation, because you fit in everything. This book should be required reading for all history classes. And Mr. Peachy also has a question. You seem of two minds about Whitman, enthralled by his unique poetic vision and his narrative, but less so by his self-centered nature. All Walt all the time is the quote.
Yeah.
How did your research alter your view of Whitman, if at all?
Oh, that's really good. And thank you both for the compliment and for the wonderful question. I hope I get to meet you someday. And you can tell me more about how great I am. But what happens with Whitman in the war is that he does change, both as a poet and as a person. And it is true that I take the pre-war Whitman a little bit to task for being narcissistic and for being always at the center of his own work. His big poem is Song of Myself, and he tends to kind of crowd other people out of his poetry, even at the same time that he's appearing to be very inclusive. Okay, he goes on, and I don't remember if it's Song of Myself, but he talks about, I have become the Eskimo in the kayak, blah blah blah. It's like, no, you're not. You're not an Eskimo. You're Walt, please. But in any case, Whitman loses some of that egocentrism in the war. And he also loses, and I think this is very important, his sense of, or his need to describe everything as perfect. The word perfect shows up in Whitman poems right and left before the war. Often, in a kind of erotic context, perfect fathers jetting perfect children, blah, blah. In the war, he's surrounded every day by people who are not physically perfect anymore. People with horrible dysentery, people with wounds that won't heal. He's surrounded by horrific sights, terrible smells. He assists at amputations, and he needs to reconsider what it is to love humanity. And one of the arguments that I make in the book is that Whitman's love of humanity is much more eroticized before the war. It remains so somewhat, but he shifts in the basis of his love from eros, the sensual, sexual love, to agape, the charitable love that the Greeks talk about. And what's so cool about it, some of the audience will know that there's this third category of Greek love called philos, which is the love of brothers. And it is Walt's love of his brother George that brings him into the war and facilitates this movement from eros to agape. So yeah,
would you say it's the intrusion of death?
Yes. Yeah.
That's the transformational moment.
Yeah, that's great too.
Wow, that is a great reading of Walt Whitman, which I have never heard. Mr. Peachy is right. Let's take it a little bit up to we're getting near the end of our time. Let me take it back to now, if people don't mind, because I am still thinking about that duty question. This is an era as you say, of tremendous generational change, of sons and daughters in breaking away from the post-revolutionary, first revolutionary fathers. But of course, we are still living in the legacy of the Civil War, as Kai writes here in the chat box. He says, you know, in these divided times, we seem to still be fighting the Civil War. And I think the themes, certainly, and a lot of the personnel and the imagery and symbols are very much the same. As Faulkner said, the past is never dead. As a Civil War historian, can you say anything about when this war might be over?
Hoo boy.
Just a little question
Yeah.
to end on.
I honestly believe that that in order for history to play a real role in our lives, it needs never to be settled. It needs never to be put away on a dusty shelf. And the true study of history is disturbing. It will upset you for for any variety of reasons. Whether you see in your ancestral past the role of the oppressor or the oppressed. There are, the history of humankind is a history of grievance, unfortunately. It's a history of glory as well. But honestly, I don't really foresee, any of these questions ever being put to bed. And I think that's a good thing, and not only that, but I'd also say that when I write a book, I'm not interested in having the last word. I don't want to put an end to the conversation. I want to move the conversation forward. And I want for people to wrestle with what I've written and to see how it applies to them. And I want them to disagree with me, provided that they've done enough thinking and reading to to base their disagreements in rational discourse.
That's asking quite a bit, isn't it? Sorry.
Yeah, it's true. I have no idea what kind of comments you've gotten from Henry Ward Beecher fans over the years. You've probably got a whole new wave coming with Polly Adler. So
well, there are a lot fewer Henry Ward Beecher fans than there are Louisa May Alcott or Oliver Wendell Holmes or Walt Whitman fans. So you get fewer comments generally.
Well, but there are more because of you.
That's for sure.
But no, it's true. I look on Eden's Outcast as being a fairly politically innocuous book. I got a letter from a reader after publishing it telling me that people like me are routinely burned at the stake, and she used present tense. So like where in the world do these people come from? But at least they're passionate.
Well, right, and there's something there. Well, and then let me close with speaking of your passionate fan, Mr. Bernard Tichy. He wants to know, what are you going to do next? Because everyone, I'm sure you're dying to jump right in.
Oh my goodness! I actually promised myself when I was finishing this book that I would stop for a little while. Because up until now, I've had one book or another under contract since I think like 2002, 2003. And I was feeling myself getting a little bit burned out and a little bit tired. So I'm a little bit between projects at the moment, but I've been doing some reading about Voltaire. I've been thinking about getting out of the American vein for a while, and perhaps writing a book about the rather fraught friendship between Voltaire and Frederick the Great, who start out being absolutely, at least intellectually in love with each other, and it ends with Frederick putting Voltaire in jail. So that could be interesting. I'm still really laying the beginning foundations for it, but it's possible that could go.
Well, Bernard says you deserve a break. You've earned it. Well, I am just delighted. Every time I get to talk to you about this book, I'm more impressed than even when I read it. It's a beautiful book. You're a beautiful writer, even when writing about the real horrors that humanity can inflict. So thank you for that. Thank you also, I want to say, to the Leon Levy Center, you guys do such fabulous work. I don't know how we all got along before you existed, but you are truly the center of biography in America, I really think. And it is a privilege to be part of anything you guys do. And I cannot wait to the day where we get to go back to and actually be in the center very soon, 2022. That's my hope. So I guess I get the last word. So thank you, John. Thank you, Kai. Thank you to Tad, everyone who has done this. And thank you so much to everyone who has been here. I hope I get to see you again very soon.
Thanks so much, Debbie. You're my hero.